It's really an honor to be here, well, first of all, in this fabulous new building. I hadn't seen it until this afternoon. You who work here, students and faculty together, lucky people to have such a fine place to do your work in. It's an honor for me to be speaking under the auspices of anything that bears the name of J.B. Jackson. He was an inspiration to me as a young writer. I met him only once, very briefly, when I was in graduate school, but the idea of writing about landscape, the idea that landscapes were worth writing about was somehow a really liberating and tantalizing thought back when I was trying to figure out what I wanted to say about the world. So it's great to be here. Thank you. This is going to be a little bit of a good news, bad news presentation. And I thought I'd get the good news over with quickly. If you like to watch landscapes change, if you like to watch ecologies reorganize themselves and large regions sort of resort and refine themselves under new circumstances, then congratulations. You've been born into exactly the best time since the dawn of civilization to do that. We're going to have a lot to see in the Southwest in the years ahead and a lot to learn. But first I want to say, for the record, that radical landscape change is not new to New Mexico or to the Southwest. This is a shot down around the Jornada experimental range just north of Las Cruces in, I can't remember, about 1912 or 15, maybe a little later in the teens. And what you see is a group of people gathered on in a black grama grassland community, which shortly became that. Pretty good transformation from grass to desert scrub. This kind of transformation was widespread throughout the Southwest, and it wasn't around the turn of the 20th century. And it wasn't restricted just to the hot deserts. The cold deserts went through this kind of thing too. This is a shot, and now I seem to have mislaid my scepter, my laser pointer. Here it is. This area up here is all grass, but a few years later, it was all sagebrush. Another flip from one kind of ecosystem to another, a state change, if you will. And there are a whole host of reasons for these transformations that took place early in the 20th century and late in the 19th. A lot of them had to do with grazing one way or another. And we can go into some of those if you want later on. But the fact is that we saw a lot of flips in the landscape. And that was troubling intellectually to the sort of professions related to land, ecology and range management and so forth. This fellow is Frederick Clements, and you all have all heard of climax communities and subclimax and pioneer communities and so forth. These formulations were basically Clements's. He was a disciple, among other things, of the social philosopher Herbert Spencer, the fellow who gives us survival of the fittest. That's his phrase, not Darwin's. Clements wanted an ordered world, a world where ecological systems, where landscapes were on a track to become what they should be. And what they should be was the highest expression of the energetics, the trophic levels, all the stuff that goes into an ecological system. But things like this flip from grassland to mesquite or grassland to sagebrush troubled that formulation. These kinds of things suggested you could have multiple climaxes for the same system. And so this was the beginning of the assault on this ordered version of the natural world, which we're seeing further revised with our contemporary experience here in the courtside, mid-court seats to watch the game of the century as the landscapes change. So here I go into the bad news. Some people might think this is just another gloom cast about climate change, and indeed the news is not very good. But let's take a walk through some of these changes and see what we learn. This is a view of the burn of the Rodeo Chetaskai fire that ravaged the central part of the Mogollon Rim in 2002. You all probably remember it. It was deemed absolutely record-setting in 2002, burned 467,000 acres. Nobody thought we'd be passing that anytime soon. Nevertheless, just last summer, the Wallow Fire topped it by exceeding over 500,000 acres. These big holes being punched into formerly the largest ponderosa pine forest on the planet are just too big for pine to come back into. They're going to shift into ecologies we haven't exactly seen before. One ecologist friend of mine says, if you've got a choice about being reincarnated as a wild plant in this century, don't pick a tree. Won't be such a good time to be a tree, or at least not a solitary, single system of a tree, a single plant. Better to pick a clonal shrub, something like Gamble oak or New Mexico locust that can be burned, resprout, burned, resprout, and keep on giving. Fires. This is the Cerro Grande fire, 2000, just blowing up on a May day. Over about 2.5 weeks, the Cerro Grande fire, which seemed singular for its virulence here in New Mexico, burned about 47,000 acres. Last summer, we saw the Las Conchas fire, burning virtually, well, a lot of the same territory and a lot more. The Las Conchas topped out over 150,000 acres. But this shot, taken on the first afternoon, on that first afternoon, the Las Conchas fire burned about 40,000 acres in its first 14 hours, almost equaling the Cerro Grande fire in less than a day. But fire isn't the only thing that's going to be troubling trees. As the weather warms, as the climate warms, it's a really good time to be an insect. Forest insects, bark beetles and spruce beetles, with warmer temperatures, the winters are milder, more beetles come through the winter and are around to begin reproducing in the spring. And the longer growing season, which is substantially longer now, the fire season alone is 78 days longer now than it was in 1970. Think of that. It's more than a month longer, both at the beginning of the season and at the end of the season. These are big changes, subtle changes, not changes we notice right away. And of course, we humans like to think that the big changes to our world are going to be dramatic. There are going to be floods and fires and storms and earthquakes. We don't think of our world changing as a result of all these little crunchy, eaty things in exoskeletons chewing their way through the landscape. But in fact, the impacts of forest insect pests are altering more acres of forest land throughout the West than these big new fires are. And you all probably remember when we had a big outbreak of bark beetles among pinon and, to a lesser degree, ponderosa pine in 2002 and 2003. This is what a beetle-infested forest can look like. All the needles turn red, but these aren't beetle-killed trees. This photograph was taken near Junction, Texas, last autumn. And these are trees, ash junipers to be specific, that all died just because of heat and drought. It's the rising heat combined with absence of water that is producing enormous mortalities through the West. Just last year, you of course followed the terrible fires south and east of Austin. Well, those were small potatoes compared to the mortality of trees just from heat and drought. Texas Forestry Service estimates that between 2 and 10% of all the trees in Texas died during last summer's drought. You know, there's something mythic about that. When you say anything in Texas, it sounds like all the beer in Texas, all the football fans in Texas, all the barbecue in Texas. These are large quantities. All the trees in Texas, that's a large quantity of trees too. And if the drought persists this year, then the cumulative sort of hydrologic debt of these trees will bring a much larger percentage of them to their ends. Well, one of the themes of the future, and I certainly made it one of the themes of my book, is that no big thing happens for just one reason. And all these troubles that the trees are facing are also an artifact of how we've tended them over the last century or so. And I won't dwell on this. This is one of those fascinating graphs that really allows me to release my inner nerd and just go on forever. And I'll spare you that. But every horizontal line is a different stand of trees. All the vertical checks are mark the year in which trees in that stand experienced surface fire. They have a fire scar on the tree that is something one can examine and date using dendrochronology. And so this is a big assemblage graph coming out of the Laboratory for Tree Ring Research down at the University of Arizona in Tucson. Anyhow, the point of it is that there was a lot of fire year after year cycling along in the forests of the Southwest until, boom, within a few years of 1890, light wildfires just stopped almost everywhere. And there are some exceptions here and here, but these exceptions to a large degree prove the rule. This is a site in the Sierra Madre in Mexico, which was far from logging, far from grazing, where the natural fire cycle continued virtually to present times. This marks the Malpais National Monument out toward Grants and Gallup. And fires continued there, not least because it was only in the 1950s or so when sufficient numbers of air tankers, aerial attack forest suppression equipment became available to bomb the wildfires there with slurry and put them out. So with the cessation of light fire, all of you know, you've read about it in the newspapers, we have so much more fuel in the forest now, and that makes them vulnerable to the big kinds of fires that we're seeing today. But this is the big picture behind that. These are the kinds of temperature increases that the prevailing climate models, the GCM, global change models, predict for our part of the world. These data, basically, these contour lines come out of the fourth assessment report of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change that was released in 2007. The IPCC in that year was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize along with Al Gore for, and Gore's movie, An Inconvenient Truth. The models that generated this information have proved since '07 to be very, very reliable. They've proved to be accurate. Their predictions are coming true with high levels of accuracy, except in one respect, and that is that the changes are occurring faster than the models predicted. And that's because the models didn't get a lot of the crucial internal feedback loops of these changes that are going on. Things involving, for instance, albedo and snowpack and magnifications that come along with steeper topography than the models could incorporate. And we can talk about that later if you want to, too. Jumping to the even bigger picture, here's an assemblage of world temperature data, getting basically a mean for the whole planet. And I want to draw your attention to the sort of break that happens in 1980, and the line becomes much more steep at that point. So remember that as we go along. This graph, you can pull it down off the internet for free. It's generated by NASA's Goddard Institute for Space Studies, which is housed at Columbia University. And the head scientist there behind the global change work is the famous Jim Hansen. I hope you've heard his name. Probably our leading climate scientist in the United States. This is one of 3 major laboratories around the world where these kinds of assemblages of global temperature information are built. And each of the labs has basically a different bundle of algorithms that they use for figuring these things out, but they all come out with essentially not the same number, but the same pattern, cross-checking each other to a very fine degree. So, speaking, I agree, disturbs me too. I want to talk a little bit about these graphs, and this is really, you're going to have to pardon me and my inner nerd, but this is recent material from Hansen and his lab. I wasn't able, it came out after my book was already published. I wish I had been able to incorporate it, but I just want to point out a couple of things to you about these graphs, and this are the 2 that I want to pay attention to. These have to do with global temperature. These have to do with northern hemisphere land temperature. And without the moderating influence of the oceans, you get a stronger accent from the land graphs. Everything is based on a mean derived from the period 1951 to 1980. 1951 is the starting point because that's when there were enough weather stations, reliable weather stations all around the world to get good planetary coverage. Before that, not so good. And the endpoint for the establishing the mean for the purposes of this analysis is 1980 because that's where temperatures began to accelerate their increase so much. So over here, what this is graphing, this is area of the Earth, this is year, and so what we're looking at here, if I can turn my back to you for just a moment, these lines represent this is one standard deviation from the norm. The norm is, you know, the bell curve. The norm is right down the middle of the bell curve, and the one standard deviation is just a short distance to the side of it. That's a very technical explanation. So anyhow, here's cold weather, one standard deviation to cold. It's the kind of weather you go out, you say, gosh, it's cold today. I don't remember it being this cold normally in February or March, whatever we are. And so here's cold is kind of going along just as you would expect it to during the normative period, and cold begins to disappear. Cold covers less and less of the surface of the Earth. And that fits the models. You know, the models tell us we're going to have more energetic weather, so we'll have more highs and more lows. But the highs are going to outnumber the lows by at least 3 to 1. So this is what we expect, less and less cold weather. Now, very cold weather, 2 standard deviations. Whoo, really cold, all right? Unpleasantly cold. That kind of weather kind of trundles along right where you would expect it, somewhere between, I don't know, 1 and 5% is where it ought to be at 2 standard deviations from the norm, and it begins to disappear here. It almost has fallen off of here. Well, what's happening with hot? Hot, 1 standard deviation, is becoming normal. In 2010, for instance, hot covered more than 80% of the surface of the planet. 80% of the planet had warm, significantly warm weather. And that doesn't mean that it's a devastating heat wave. Some of these extremes are darn pleasant. I mean, LA just had like it was 80 degrees on the beach at Malibu last New Year's Day. Nobody complained. But it was extraordinary. Very hot weather comes along and it begins to kick up, and it gets to where just hot used to be. So very hot is replacing hot. But here's the kicker. Extremely hot is coming along here. And this is 3 standard deviations from the norm, and let me try to put that in perspective. Something that is 3 standard deviations from the mean would occur less often than once a century. So think of this as like a 150-year or a 200-year flood, a 150-year or a 200-year heat wave. Okay? These things should be down here almost indistinguishable from the bottom line of the graph. But here we go. In 2010, this 3 standard deviation extremely hot weather touched close to 20% of the surface of the Earth. And we can look at the lab, Hansen's lab, has given us this information to look at spatially too. And so here's 2010. Do you remember the fires in Siberia? Do you remember the heat wave in Moscow? Did you read about the drought in Kenya? All those things are here. See, here's the balanced old world, and here it's getting hotter and pinker and hotter and beigeier and hotter and hotter. And last summer, there you are. That's 2 to 10% of the trees in Texas dying right there. This is a brave new world. We haven't been here before. We don't know very much about this. These kinds of changes are challenging to our very worldview, and certainly they're challenging to the way we try to manage the Earth. Stationarity is basically an engineering term. Stationarity is the assumption that what happened in the past is the pattern of what will happen in the future. And so in engineering, stationarity gives us the idea, the concept of a 100-year flood or a 50-year flood or a 100-year heat wave. What these people, Chris Milley and Julio Betancourt, people I interviewed for the book, are saying is that those old ways of predicting the future are now irrelevant. As Tony Sobrano would say, forget about it. We have to go to new quote, probabilistic models if we're going to deal with the future. And that's true in ecology too. You know, the Clementsian paradigm of climax systems, climax communities, really went out the window quite a while ago, but it was largely replaced by the idea of a range of natural variability. That the dynamic Earth would do this and do that and do this and do that, but it would do it all within parameters that were fairly well established and that we could know about. But the idea of a range of natural variability holds water only if the conditions that set those parameters are stable. Those conditions tend to be soil and climate. And if climate changes, well, then that whole idea of natural variability just kind of wobbles off like a satellite in unstable orbit. So we're really going into some new country. And going into new country is part of what so irritated people about what this guy was saying, Mr. Darwin. He was telling us that evolution wasn't headed anywhere in particular. It wasn't taking us to a city on the hill. It wasn't achieving God's plan. It didn't have an address. You couldn't locate the future that evolution was taking us to. And I think I have, I'm not going to give anybody any money, but I'm going to find this. This is the last sentence of his, on the origin of species. He talks about the competition for survival. And he concludes, there is grandeur in this view of life, with its several powers, having been originally breathed into a few forms or into one, and that, whilst this planet has gone cycling on according to the fixed law of gravity, from so simple a beginning, endless forms most beautiful and most wonderful have been and are being evolved. And it's just going to go on and on and on. No fixed destination, no teleological end point. Drove people crazy then, still drives them crazy today. And climate change drives them crazy the same way. And I have to admit some sympathy with this, because I think back to the things I wrote starting out as a historian, and I know there are other historians here, I don't know if you'll agree with me, but as a budding I look back and see myself as a budding environmental historian, and I think that there was a quality of innocence to what I wrote back then, and to my mind, to my worldview at that time. An innocence, a belief that no matter how beaten up the earth was, everything was all where it needed to be, and that things could come back, and it would be okay in the end. But writing this more recent book about climate change, I feel that innocence is lost. I feel that we're going into a much less innocent, a much more uncertain, a much more challenging sort of future. The resistance to acknowledging climate change takes many, many forms. We could talk about that all night. This one captures quite a few of them, and it's not just because there's no address for the future. But you know, when your world looks like it might come apart, you want to hunker down and just hold steady. The American Psychological Association did a kind of white paper, a big fat report on the sort of psychological mechanisms whereby people would deny climate change. And other people have done other studies. They're just, you could fill a bookshelf with those formulations. So many different ways that people ignore the facts on the ground. John Kenneth Galbraith, however, probably summed it up best. He said, and this was not apropos specifically of climate change, it was much more general, But he said, faced with the necessity of changing one's mind or proving that it is unnecessary to do so, nearly everybody gets busy on the proof. And that, unfortunately, has led us to a great deal of delay in terms of dealing with climate change. I think of it as a tragedy that we're all involved in. We're all sort of collectively the protagonist of this tragedy. And it has kind of classical dimensions, Shakespearean dimensions. You know, you have the protagonist who has that fatal flaw, that bull-headed Othello in this instance, or Otello, depending on whether you're going with Shakespeare or Verdi. But that bull-headedness, that willingness to listen to Iago. And boy, we have no shortage of Iagos. Think of the number of Iagos who worked on trying to convince the American public that there was nothing wrong with smoking cigarettes in terms of one's health back in the 60s and 70s, and I'm sure some of you all remember those debates. Well, today we have an even greater army of Iagos telling us that the world will end if we wean ourselves from fossil fuels. And so what happens? Well, Othello destroys that which he loves the most, and enough said there. When we talk about the Southwest, of course, we always wind up talking about water. How can we not? The human landscapes of the Southwest will be most affected by changes in hydrology in the years ahead. And to make that clear, I just want to say a word about the general dynamics of climate change. If you look at this with me, this is hot air rising from the equator and dropping its moisture as it rises and cools. That's why the equator is so rainy. That air, having cooled and dried, hits the bottom of the stratosphere and begins moving north, or toward the poles, north in the northern hemisphere, south in the southern. This is how the Earth kind of moves heat around. It's the second law of thermodynamics at work, trying to even out the heat energy within the system. That air comes back down to the surface of the planet in a circulation called the Hadley cell. And as it comes down, it compresses with greater air pressure, and it heats up, and it's dry. And so this dry, hot air is coming down, and usually around 30 degrees north latitude and 30 degrees south latitude. If you look at a map of the deserts of the world, you see them mostly in a band, mostly along those latitudes. Well, here's sort of the idiot's guide, which is my guide. This is the only way I can get to it, to climate change, is you have this system, and you're going to put more heat into it, or the same amount of heat into it, but let less heat out. So heat builds up in here, so you build energy in here. This becomes a more energetic system, more muscular. It's like you've shot it with steroids, got more oomph. So what happens? Well, with more oomph, you get more extreme events. Higher highs, lower lows, wilder winds, more tornadoes in the Midwest, all that sort of thing. You also get these circulations moving with more oomph. And with more oomph, they can expand. One of the reasons the global models predict that the Southwest will get hotter and drier is the thought that the Hadley cell is going to expand so that, you know, eventually, let's say it's coming down more at 32 degrees north, or eventually 34 degrees north. It's Durango now, then it becomes Tucson, then it becomes Albuquerque, on and on. So that's one of the ideas working here. The other thing is that if there's more oomph in the system, then wet places will get wetter, and dry places will get drier. That's another sort of idiot's rule of thumb. And this map kind of shows you that. It also shows you roughly the deserts of the world. You can see along 30 north, and the Atacama is down here at 30 south, and a lot of Australia is sort of hanging over 30 south. This map is showing you the blue areas are areas that are going to get wetter during the next half century, and the red and brown areas are areas that will be getting drier over the next half century. This map actually is where my book, A Great Aridness, began. I was sitting in a hotel conference room here in Albuquerque in January of '06, and Jonathan Overpeck, a climatologist from the University of Arizona, put this up on the screen. And I looked at that and I thought, oh my goodness, look at what's going to happen to our home, the land we love. We're already a water-stressed area of the world, and what this is telling us, in fact, I can show you what it tells us in text on the next slide. Almost all model runs agree on the direction of 21st century change in certain regions. Prominent regions of agreement on decreasing, typically 10 to 30% runoff, include Southern Europe, the Middle East, mid-latitude Western North America, that's us, and Southern Africa. So imagine our region, stressed as it is now for water, with 10 to 30% less available to work with. Talking about a very significant set of challenges. Now, this study by Chris Milley is not the only one that has plowed this ground. There have been plenty of others. I'm not going to try to inflict others on you. But in general, the models agree fairly strongly that the Southwest is going to dry out. Now, it's not just temperature. And here's another rule of thumb in the Idiot's Guide to Climate Change, and that is that as things get hotter, they're going to get a lot drier even if precipitation stays steady. But don't bet your house that it will. That's because with higher temperatures you have more evaporation, a lot more evaporation. And so, even if our storms stay the same, we're going to be effectively a lot drier. And incidentally, one thing I'll say quickly about the expanding Hadley cell, one of the fears is that if the cell does expand northward, it will pose more of a barrier to winter storms that carry our storable water, our snows, more of a barrier to those storms that come from the northern Pacific and bring us abundant snowfall during El Nino years. If those storms are blocked out, we're in a bit of a worse situation than we otherwise would be. So, when it comes down to water, the biggest game in the region, the greatest drama, is going to be played out at Lake Mead. And this is a shot from Lake Mead in December of 10, December 2010, when the lake was just beating, it was going to a new low, beating the previous low achieved during the drought of the 1950s. This, of course, is on the Colorado River, and something like 30 million people in the United States and Mexico depend on the Colorado for all or part of their water. And that includes the great cities of the Southwest, all except for Albuquerque, really, and El Paso, but Tucson and Phoenix and San Diego and Los Angeles and Tijuana, believe it or not, and Mexicali, and many more. A study by some people at Scripps predicted that Lake Mead was in danger of failure. Failure of a reservoir means that the water level gets down so low that you can't get any downstream. You can't get any water past the dam. That study resulted in quite a bit of a furor. There were other studies done to corroborate, disprove, whatever. In the end, and I'm quoting now from one of the authors of the study that sort of did the check on this, and that author told me that after 2026, that's not very many years away, after 2026, the risk of failure of Lake Mead just skyrockets, he says, just skyrockets. By the middle of the century, the risk of failure, if we go on the way we're going, and I'm going to explain about that in a moment, the risk of failure will be very high indeed. But here's part of the magic of the Colorado River. It's not just a southwestern river, it's also a northern Rockies river. It collects water from both regions, and so it has this kind of balancing. When it's dry down here, it can be wet up north. When it's wet up north, it can be wet down here. But this graph of the level of Lake Mead is to me a kind of icon of the history of the Southwest. You can see a lot of the region's history in it. Here's the beginning. The dam closes in the depths of the Great Depression. Water builds up, builds up, builds up, builds up. Drought of the 1950s. Look at that son of a gun. That really, really dried her out. And then back up, and then this is a human-caused decline. Anybody want to venture a... No, but it's something humans did. Glen Canyon was closed in 1963. And so this is water, that was great. This is water being held behind Glen Canyon to form Lake Powell. So we come back, and here's this period that so many of us think of as normal, this period 1975 roughly to 1990. Abundant water. Who's worried about anything? Not us, certainly. This actually, and we can look at this in another context, this is one of the most anomalous wet periods in the history of the Southwest, going back more than 1,000 years. So then we have a little bit of worry, but then boom, times again, right here, until 2000, and then we just start falling off a cliff. It's like a ball or a rock falling off a cliff, and it just bounces a few times on the way down. And this is when that picture was taken, when the new low was set. But look at the rescue. You may recall that last winter was really snowy up in the northern Rockies. And so Lake Mead is making a 40-plus foot recovery over the course of the past year. And we need those recoveries. We need all the recovery we can get, as long as it just doesn't cause the kind of complacence that will allow us to continue with the behaviors we're engaged in now. And again, no big thing happens for just one reason. The prospective water shortages in the Colorado system are not just the result of climate. They're the result of humans doing what we do so well, which is to use things to the maximum. Ed Abbey put it very well. He said the Southwest has plenty of water. It's just the cities are in the wrong places. So here's what's going on right now. The Lower Basin on the Colorado, which involves California, Arizona, and Nevada, basically. New Mexico has a tiny interest, but it's not worth talking about. Here's the budget right now. Average inflows, 9.0 million acre feet. That's what MAF stands for. 8.23 MAF from Lake Powell. This is under the current rules. The entitlement of the Lower Basin is actually 7.5 million acre feet. It's more than that, but that's a different. They get more than that, but that's another story. There are inflows below Powell below Lee's Ferry. So basically the lower basin is getting 9 million acre feet a year. Good. Okay. It's consuming 7.5 million acre feet, and that's the full allocation. Divided 4.4 to California, 2.8 to Arizona, and 0.3 to Nevada, Reed, Las Vegas. And then we have a treaty obligation to Mexico of 1.5 million acre feet. And then here's the kicker. Some people say this is 1.4, some people say this is 1.2. Let's just call it 1.3 million acre feet lost in evaporation from the big reservoirs and from system losses. And system losses are things like seepage. The water seeps into the ground. Some of this water just kind of disappears. I don't know, maybe Jack Nicholson is coming back from Chinatown and spiriting some off in some direction we don't know about. But anyhow, there's a net annual deficit right now of 1.4 million acre feet. And I don't care how big Lake Mead is, if you're operating at an annual deficit of this size, then eventually, if supply is constant, you're going to run the lake dry. Now, the lower basin has been getting by with this kind of overuse mainly because of two things. One is wet weather that just sent it sort of bonuses of extra water from time to time. But the more important factor is that the upper basin wasn't highly developed. The upper basin states of Idaho and Utah and Wyoming and Colorado developed much more slowly than the lower basin. And so the water they didn't use, their entitlement that they didn't use, simply flowed down the river, and the lower basin, mainly California, very happily gobbled it up. Well, that can't continue indefinitely for a number of reasons, and climate change is only one. Climate change is probably going to reduce those available inflows, but you don't need climate change to be concerned about a reduction in inflows. The Colorado River Compact, on which those allocations of 7.5 million for the lower basin and 7.5 million for the upper basin was based, assumed a reliable annual flow of about 17 million acre feet per year. And that compact was basically negotiated during this period. You can see there's a problem there. The data set was very small, and the data set was drawn from a very, very anomalously wet period. So this is, I should have said, this is a reconstruction of the flows of the Colorado at Lee's Ferry, the dividing point between the upper basin and the lower basin. This reconstruction is based on dendrochronology. It's very, as the scientists like to say, robust. It's probably the best of several that have been done. It's also the most generous in terms of the amount of water that it postulates being available. And the mean for this 1,000, almost 1,300 year period is 14.7 million acre feet, not 17 million acre feet, which is what the compact was based on. So you see, even absent climate change, if we just have a reversion to the long-term paleo mean for river flows, we, all of us, the lower basin especially on the Colorado system, can be in a world of hurt. The Rio Grande, on which we depend here in central New Mexico, has a similar kind of biography. Not a lot of difference. There are other factors that can give us pause too. And let me find my place here. And one of them is the concept of megadrought. A megadrought, you know, the drought of the 50s is really about the worst that we've had on recent record until the droughts of just the last 10 years. The drought of the 50s lasted less than a decade. The drought that brought down Chaco Canyon lasted more than 30 years. We've experienced times as dry in the Southwest as the people of Chaco experienced, but not for as long. There hasn't been a mega drought, a multi-decadal drought in the Southwest in modern times. So this kind of phenomenon, which is characteristic not just of the American Southwest, but of semi-arid and arid regions all around the world, everywhere. Mega droughts have popped up in the record the more scientists have looked. This kind of phenomenon is one that we haven't seen and frankly we're not ready for. And the places that are most vulnerable are places downstream in Arizona, for instance. But let me pause for a moment and say, you know, in a way, we who live close to the Rio Grande, we're the lucky ones. People who live on the Colorado system, they can be the lucky ones too, because these are big rivers. They have the capacity to move a lot of water over long distance efficiently. And there's big plumbing on them. In the Southwest, if we really think the way J.B. Jackson would think about landscapes and about how the landscapes are going to change, as things dry out, some of the biggest impacts are going to be tiny communities, off and out of the way, that depend on a very small lake, let's say, for its water supply, or on groundwater that can be depleted, or isolated ranchsteads and homesteads scattered across the landscape where the well very well may run dry. I think we're going to see probably a shrinkage with the aridification of the region, a shrinkage of settlement back to the cities, and then the cities themselves potentially with really terrific challenges. This map depicts the Central Arizona project, one of the colossal achievements of plumbing in the modern Southwest. It takes water off the Colorado River at Lake Havasu and puts it through tunnels under a mountain. It pumps it over ridges. It siphons it through other kinds of hazards and difficulties, finally getting it to Phoenix and then ultimately down to south of Tucson. And here's another little topic that maybe we want to talk about afterward, but a marvelous piece of political history of the Southwest has to do with the authorization for this, because in order to get this authorized in Congress, the Arizona congressional delegation and the then Secretary of the Interior, Stuart Udall, wonderful man, had to give in to a deal they didn't like, and that has big implications. Basically, with the California delegation in the House being this big and the Arizona delegation being this big, Arizona couldn't get authorization through the House of Representatives. So they had to give in and subordinate the water rights that would go into the Central Arizona project to all of California's water rights. So this 1.6 million acre feet of water is authorized to flow through here. But if there's a shortage in the Lower Basin, and if deliveries are cut back, California will not cut back its use. It will not get less water. Its proportionate share of cutbacks will come out of the share of the Central Arizona project. Which is to say that politically, it could come about that people are still washing their cars liberally in the San Fernando Valley, and there's not a drop of water in this thing feeding Phoenix and Tucson, and many, many cities in between. It's another big story. At any rate, the Central Arizona project, if Lake Mead fails, that subordination of rights becomes completely moot, because if Lake Mead fails, there's no water coming down here anyhow, either for the CAP or for the Colorado River Aqueduct that takes Colorado River water to Los Angeles and San Diego. We could talk about a lot of other things too, a lot of other consequences of climate change in the Southwest. The effect on populations being one of them. This is a picture, of course, of our border wall. This is down near Sierra Vista and the San Pedro River. Climate change is going to put populations in motion all around the world. India is building a wall against Bangladeshis. Egypt is worried about the Sudanese. Spain is very, very concerned about Morocco, and Morocco is concerned about everybody else in the Western Sahara. In periods of want, people are going to move. Big impacts, too, on wildlife, some of which cannot move. This is the Mount Graham red squirrel. It occupies the top of Mount Graham, an area that's been ravaged by both insect infestation and stand-changing fire. It can't move unless it can find a way to live in the air, and that's not going to happen. The impacts on wildlife will be quite severe, or on many species, not all species. Which leaves us exactly where we are today. You know, there is a tipping point out there somewhere at which we will get out of the pot. But we're still in the pot now. Unfortunately, the arrival of that tipping point is likely to be disaster-driven. Bad things are going to happen before enough people wake up. We're trying to shake Othello now. We're saying, Othello, come to your senses, snap out of it. You don't want the XL pipeline. You just think you do. We all try to do those things. And there's a lot at stake. But I do have some faith that that tipping point is there, and I think about how rapidly things can change. If you go back to 1988, 89, the Berlin Wall comes down, the Soviet Union breaks up. It only took a couple of years, and the political map of the world was redrawn. These things can happen. We must pray that they do happen. As we think about that tipping point and those changes, the metaphor that comes to my mind is one of a set of rapids. You know, if you're, I'm sure there's some boaters in here, if you're going into some really big, long rapids, you know that about all you can control is your point of entry. You've got to get the place right, you've got to get the angle right, the velocity right, and if you nail that, you've got a good chance of making the moves that you see you need to make as you go farther down the rapids. If you miss your point of entry, then, you know, it's all just dumb luck and chaos from there. Anything can happen. So as a society, we need to be thinking about our point of entry. These rapids of climate change are going to be infinitely long, very turbulent, full of chaos, extremely difficult, and we need to get our point of entry right. And as we think about that, I have to say I'm a little bit at war with myself. I like to say I'm an intellectual pessimist, but a neurochemical optimist. You know, maybe it's just the serotonin talking, but although the outlook is grim, the sunrise is beautiful. And as long as that beauty is there, we all have so much good work to do, to rally, to defend the beauty of the planet and its creatures. And its creatures include us, the beauty here in this room, the beauty of human society. These are all things that we need to be taking care of. And I think about a place like this, a school of architecture and planning. So much of what we do when we finally get to that tipping point is going to be to redraw, reorganize, redraft the way we live, the way we share, the way we move resources, the way we use the landscape in this marvelous Southwest of ours, which is so full of beauty. So a lot of the key work of the future, I pray, is being born in this building right now. And work, I think about work, the gift of good work, the balm of work. As long as there is good work, there is no reason to be pessimistic. There is only reason to get on with the work. And a lot of that work is educating and organizing. When in doubt, educate and organize. Educate and organize. And we'll just carry on with the work and make our new Southwest the best place we can make it. Thank you very much.